The pagan celebration of Lemuria was celebrated on May 13th, and it was the pagan celebration of the dead. They would honor all their dead on May 13th. And during that time, the larvae, or the ghosts of the dead, would come out and haunt the living. To keep this from happening, the early Romans would pour milk on the graves of the departed and offer them little cakes to not haunt them. In the year 609 AD, the Catholic Church Christianized Lemuria by naming it All Saints' Day, which is the day they set aside to honor the holiest of all Christians. It didn't take very long for All Saints' Day to completely phase out Lemuria, within a generation. And they had such success with it that then they began converting the Celts. So they moved All Saints' Day from May 13th to October 31st, so that it could squish out Christianize Samhain. All Saints' Day eventually became known as All Hallows' Day. Now, because Samhain was celebrated the day before, and because it was a nighttime celebration, Samhain became known as All Hallows' Evening, which was later shortened to All Hallows' Even, eventually to Hallows' Even, and then finally to Halloween in about 609 AD. Now, the church had sanctioned All Saints' Day, which was only there to honor the holiest of all Christians. And congregations of people said, what about our friends? What about our loved ones? So they named November 2nd as All Souls' Day. And this was a day that Christians could honor the souls of their departed. On All Souls' Day, you could pray for the souls of your loved ones who were trapped in purgatory, who hadn't quite made it to heaven, but they weren't all the way in hell, but purgatory was a pretty uncomfortable place anyway. Now, according to the tradition, if a soul got enough prayers, it would suddenly fly up and go to heaven. So we would celebrate on November 2nd, All Souls' Day. We would pray for any of our friends or loved ones who were trapped in purgatory, because if they got enough of those prayers, they wouldn't have to live there anymore, they'd go to heaven. Now, during the Dark Ages, children and beggars would go souling door to door, which meant they would knock on your door, and if you offered them a soul cake, in return they would pray for the souls of your loved ones. So the more people who came to your door and you offered them a cake, they would eat the cake and then they would pray for your loved ones so that they could get enough prayers to not be trapped in purgatory anymore. Striking resemblance to Halloween. Now, how do we start wearing masks? The rowdy beggars, this became such a tradition that you could go from door to door and get these little cakes that the kids and beggars said, wow, this is pretty cool stuff. And the beggars started to enjoy the drink as much as they did the cake. And if you didn't give them what they wanted, as they asked for a soul cake, they had a tendency to be a little more destructive. So they would put on masks so that you wouldn't know who ruined your property, who had vandalized you, if you didn't give them a soul cake. In the early 1700s, people in Britain would dress in costumes and put on plays going house to house, almost like caroling, only with little plays with costumes and masks. And at the end of their performance, if they stopped at your house, you would reward them with food or drink or money. And this became how people would begin to celebrate All Hallows' Eve. Now on November 5th, 1605, a guy named Guy Fawkes decided to blow up the House of Lords in London. And he tried to do it with 36 kegs of dynamite. He was stopped, tried, hung, and quartered. However, on the anniversary of that, November 5th, that following year and every year thereafter, the children of London would mock the memory of Guy Fawkes by causing chaos in the streets. It was eventually called Guy Fawkes Day, which is still celebrated today. It would consist of parading, begging, being destructive, creating bonfires, all in reference to Guy Fawkes. Now, across the pond in America, the Puritans were very strong believers in the Bible and the biblical traditions, and their interpretation of the supernatural was a really scary place, full of demons and scary, menacing forces of devils. not something they wanted. So they tried to squish out Guy Fawkes Day and this All Hallows Eve celebration from ever making it to America. However, there were a few Guy Fawkes supporters who had migrated in also, and Guy Fawkes parties started to show up in America. The new immigrants also began to have their All Hallows Eve celebrations. Now, during the Civil War, about the time the Civil War ended in 1965, it ended with over 500,000 dead bodies, many of which were unclaimed and unknown. The family members, if you had a family member who went off to war, you didn't know if they were dead and were these unclaimed people or if they were just trying to get home. You just didn't know. And so America became obsessed with death during that time because so many people were dead and there were so many bodies all over the place that folks didn't know what to do with. And so those stories would become more and more popular during this time. Now we all know the famous jack-o'-lantern associated with Halloween. According to European legend, there was an actual man named Jack-o'-lantern. Now Jack was a bit of a troublesome fellow. In fact, Jack was so bad, he managed to get himself kicked out of hell. Now that's not an easy thing to do. Be bad enough to get kicked out of hell, but Jack did it. And as Jack was leaving hell, the devil himself scooped up an ember of hellfire and gave it to Jack to light his way out. Jack, not wanting to be burned, placed that ember in a hollowed out turnip in order to find his way. And European children began carving their own jack-o'-lanterns out of hard, hollowed out turnips thereafter. Now American kids saw that pumpkins were coming to harvest about the time of Samhain or All Hallows Eve. So they decided to use them instead of turnips. Now for the pranksters of the time, which still had a lot of that energy from Guy Fawkes Day, was scaring people in that time. Playing a prank, playing a trick. And as the people at the time were very superstitious, they would carve that smiley face, that eerie glow, into a pumpkin, and they would light it with a candle, and they would put it on the end of a stick, and they would cover the stick with a sheet. And then they would raise it up in front of your window, and raise it up in front of another window, which obviously scared a lot of folks. So the kids got the enjoyment out of doing that. It became one of the first Halloween tricks. Now, the Scotch and Irish immigrants brought their destructive Halloween tendencies of throwing rocks, setting fires, playing pranks as they came to America with the memories of their Samhain celebration. Now, American boys began to look forward to Halloween because they could beg for goodies and they could play pranks. And they could do it with a mask, so no one would know who they were, so they'd get away with it. Halloween pranks became known as Halloween tricks, and they got more and more destructive. Throwing rocks, removing gates. Think of how important gates were in that time. They would remove the gates and your whole herd would wander away. In fact, at the time they said that it was bogey night, that there was a bogey on every turnstile, or a boogeyman. And so the kids would take the gate away as part of playing the prank. They would take some farmers' wagons, disassemble them, and reassemble them on the roof of their barn. They would also break windows and set fires. Now, during the Great Depression, people just didn't have the money to replace what the vandals had done. They barely had time and money to put out the fires. Halloween became known as Mischief Night, or Gate Night, or for some Hell Night and for others Devil's Night. In early cities like Chicago and Detroit, as many as 1,000 fires would be set that night. And during the Great Depression, they just didn't have the resources to deal with them. So, towns and cities began to try to find ways for kids to have fun, to distract them. What would be more fun to do than all this mischief, all this chaos? And so they started to arrange town-wide parties and dances and costume contests, give them something else to look forward to. In 1933, Sears produced its first boxed costume to try to make it easy for kids to be able to take part in these celebrations. Now there was one very wise woman who was tired of having her house pranked or tricked every year. Having to replace windows, the eggs, taking the paint off, and she was tired of that. And so rather than rebelling against it, she said, if you can't beat them, join them. She had a party for all her neighborhood kids. And every kid who showed up, she gave them a treat. And she said, if I give you this treat, you don't trick me. And they said, fair enough. Well, a local journalist caught wind of this and her success with it and published it in the paper. And other people reading it said, that sounds like a pretty darn good idea. So they began to offer treats as well in lieu of tricks. You could get one or the other, not both. Kind of like a hand hug shake, right? Either, not both. So other people began to follow suit. Now kids would show up at your door dressed in a costume and they would say to you, trick or treat. Because they were in costume, you didn't know who they were. So if you gave them a treat, they said thank you, and they went to the next house to see if that house would give them a treat. And if you said, I'm not giving you a treat, they said, then you choose trick. Fully disguised, where you couldn't go tell my parents, I'm now going to go up and remove your gate or break a window or play a trick. Now the saying of trick or treat is only actually about 80 years old. Now with these kids, if you bribed them with candy, your house would be safe and they just walk to the next house. But their identity is guarded by the costume. So just like in life today, you would decide a trick or a treat. Now how does this work into today's celebration? How can, although the knowledge is great, but how it started, where it came from, makes all kind of sense as to the celebration that we have today. But how can we apply it to our lives right now, today? Think about your words. Think about your thoughts for just a second. There's something in your life you want to do. There is something you either want to do that you've not done, or that you want to do better, or you want different results. Which button do you tell yourself? Which button do you light up for the whole world to see and ask them to help you? Do you say, I would love to do this, but gosh, it's going to be hard. Oh, if it was only that easy. And we give all the excuses that we can for pressing our hard button. And just like in the play, people, circumstances, situations, and things show up to support us and say, you're right. Now think just for a moment, you have the same option, like with trick or with treat, to say easy or hard. That same thing that you want in your life or you want to experience to a different degree, has nothing to do with what the news is saying, what other people's perception of the world is. It has only to do with what your perception of the world is. Like Philosophical Fred, who decided to not participate in this recession. He was one guy who needed one job, and there were companies that needed one employee. The overall grand scheme of things, although he understood it, he chose not to buy into it. It's the same thing in our world. Anything that we want can be easy or can be hard. We come from a God who is kind enough to give us the choice and the power to manifest. God is the ultimate creator and we're his kids. So we have the same abilities that God does. And his greatest gift to all of us was the ability to poke this button or this button in any situation and be right. And be right. Praise God. That is so cool and so empowering to know that anything in your life you want, you get to decide which button you push. I can't push your button or your button or your button or your button no matter how much I may want to. It's off limits. God, him or herself, does not have the ability to press your button for you. It has revoked its own ability to press your button by giving you the gift of free will. If God can't do it, we can't do it either for each other. We can only do it for ourselves. And as we look back on our life, we can see that we were right every time we pushed either button. Any time in our lives that we said, I want to do this, but it's tough, it's difficult, I'm not sure, there's no way, that was exactly what showed up in our world. And every time instead we pushed the other button and we said, you know, I can do that. That's easy. God, help me let it be easy. Room full of friends, help me let it be easy. Guides and angels, help me let it be easy. God, please, help me let this be easy. And when people would ask, what's going on? Oh yeah, I'm doing this and da-da-da, and I'm excited about it, and it's easy, and it's flowing, and it's this, and it's that. And just like the gal with the phone call, sometimes it's that quick that what we want becomes